The scent of sizzling ribs filled the air, mingling with the smoky char of burning wood. Marcus Carter wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, admiring the slow, steady fire beneath his grill. This wasn't just any Sunday afternoon. It was a ritual. His backyard, his sanctuary, a place where his late father had taught him the perfect balance of heat and patience. But peace never lasted long in certain neighborhoods. A sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Marcus turned to see a woman standing stiffly at the edge of his yard. Platinum blonde bob, designer sunglasses, arms crossed tight like she was bracing for a storm. The type who didn't ask questions. She made accusations. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm. "I don't think you belong here," she snapped, already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He'd lived here for years, built a life, a business. But now, in the eyes of this woman, none of that mattered. Then, just as her fingers hovered over the screen, he noticed something, a flicker of recognition in her face, a split second of fear. And in that moment, Marcus knew. She had a secret, one he was about to uncover. Marcus Carter had always believed in the power of resilience. It was a lesson he'd learned from his father, a man who had built a name for himself in the tight-knit barbecue scene of Atlanta, a man who had taught Marcus that fire, just like life, needed control, too much heat, and it would burn everything down, too little, and it wouldn't cook at all. After his father passed, Marcus poured everything into Carter's Smokehouse, a small but beloved catering business he ran from home. His backyard wasn't just a patch of grass. It was his workspace, his test kitchen, his legacy. A place where the slow hum of jazz played from an old speaker, where his dog, Duke, lays in the shade of the magnolia tree, and where the rich aroma of hickory and spice drifted through the air like a promise. He'd worked hard to build this life, and it wasn't easy. The neighborhood was changing, new people, new rules, new tensions. Some folks welcomed him with a nod and a polite wave. Others, well, they made it clear he was an outsider, even in his own home. He'd had complaints before about smoke drifting too far, about noise when he was just listening to music at a reasonable volume. He knew what it was really about. Still, Marcus refused to let it get to him. He focused on his business, on perfecting every rub, every sauce, every slow-cooked masterpiece. His mother always told him, "Let your work speak louder than their ignorance." And so he did. That afternoon, he was preparing a special order for a community event when the interruption came. The woman, the one standing stiffly at the edge of his yard, phone in hand, wasn't just another nosy neighbor. There was something different in the way she looked at him. Like she wasn't just annoyed. She was nervous. Marcus had seen her before, though they'd never spoken. Her house sat 2 doors down, one of the newly remodeled properties that had sold for way above market value. She always had the same expression, lips pursed like she just smelled something unpleasant. But now, as she glared at him, ready to make that call, something flickered across her face. Recognition, a flash of something deeper than just irritation. Marcus straightened, wiping his hands clean, studying her as much as she was studying him. Something about this moment felt different. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus had the distinct feeling that this wasn't just another case of a nosy Karen trying to ruin his day. No! This was personal, and he was about to find out why. Marcus kept his expression calm, though inside, his pulse was hammering. He'd dealt with people like her before. People who saw him, a black man minding his business, and still found a reason to call the cops. But something about her hesitation, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, made him pause. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was loud enough for Marcus to hear as the woman held the phone to her ear. This man is trespassing, she said, her voice tight. I don't feel safe. Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay level. Ma'am, I live here, he said, nodding toward his house. Been here for years. She blinked rapidly, as if processing his words, but didn't lower the phone. I've never seen you before. Marcus scoffed. That's funny, 'cause I've seen you. He stepped forward just slightly, not enough to be threatening, but enough to let her know he wasn't about to shrink. In fact, I think I know who you are. A shadow crossed her face. The color drained from her cheeks. I don't know what you're talking about, she snapped, gripping the phone tighter, but her voice wavered. Then, something clicked in Marcus' mind. He couldn't place it at first, but there was something about her, something familiar. A memory stirred. He thought back to a few weeks ago, when he'd been sorting through his late father's old boxes, sifting through faded photographs and brittle newspaper clippings. His father had kept records, business receipts, letters from customers, even old grievances. And there, in the stack, had been a name, Catherine Whitmore. Marcus took another step, watching as her breath hitched. That's your name, isn't it? He said, testing the waters. She took a half step back, the phone trembling slightly in her hand. How do you... Marcus felt the realization hit like a freight train. He hadn't known it then, but his father had mentioned her. Not as a neighbor, not as some concerned citizen, but as a woman tied to something bigger. Something his father had fought against. Something ugly. Yeah, Marcus murmured, nodding to himself as the pieces fell into place. I do know who you are. Catherine's breathing grew shallow, and for the first time, she looked less like an entitled woman trying to police a black man's existence, and more like someone caught. Marcus didn't know what secret she was hiding yet, but now he was going to find out. Catherine lowered her phone slowly, her face pale. The dispatcher's voice crackled on the line, "Ma'am?" "Hello." But she ended the call without another word. Marcus crossed his arms, watching her carefully. He could see the gears turning in her head, the way her fingers twitched like she was debating whether to run or fight. I don't know what you think you know, she said, her voice lower now, almost pleading. Marcus let out a humorless chuckle. That's funny, 'cause I don't think I know. He stepped back toward his grill, poking at the coals like he wasn't rattled, like his stomach wasn't twisting with the weight of what he was about to say. He didn't have the full picture yet, but he had enough. His father had written Catherine Whitmore's name in the margins of an old legal document, a case, something about an incident from decades ago. And now here she was, standing in front of him, trying to erase him from a place that was rightfully his. It wasn't a coincidence. You knew my father, didn't you? Marcus asked, turning back to her. That's why you looked at me like that, like you'd seen a ghost. Catherine's lips pressed into a tight line. Before she could finish, the sound of a door opening interrupted them. Marcus? He turned to see his neighbor, Mrs. Ruiz, stepping onto her porch across the street. She was in her 60s, a retired teacher with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue when it came to neighborhood nonsense. She'd lived here for decades, long before people like Catherine started moving in, changing things. You all right? Mrs. Ruiz called, her eyes flicking between him and Catherine. Marcus forced a smile. Yeah, just having a little chat with my concerned neighbor here. Mrs. Ruiz didn't miss a thing. She caught the tension immediately. She said, giving Catherine a pointed look before folding her arms. Funny how some folks don't mind their own business until it's convenient. Catherine bristled but said nothing. Marcus knew he had a choice. He could let her walk away, pretend this never happened, or he could dig deeper. He went inside later that night, pulling out the old box of his father's documents. He sifted through faded receipts, handwritten notes, and finally he found it. A newspaper clipping from 1994. The headline read, "Local barbecue owner alleges racial discrimination in land dispute," and beneath it, a black and white photo of his father, standing outside his old restaurant, the one he lost. Marcus scanned the article, his pulse racing. The story was all too familiar. His father had leased a property downtown, built it up into a thriving restaurant. But then the land was suddenly rezoned, permits revoked, fines piled up. The building was condemned over safety concerns that never seemed to exist before. And the name of the woman involved in pushing those policies? Catherine Whitmore. Marcus sat back, exhaling slowly. She hadn't just called the cops on him today. She'd played a role in destroying his father's dream decades ago. The next morning, he decided to confront her. Catherine was outside, pretending to check her mailbox, but Marcus knew she'd been waiting. Her stiff posture, the way her fingers fidgeted. It wasn't just guilt. It was fear. "You knew," Marcus said, holding up the article. "You were part of this." Catherine's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I read everything," he continued, his voice steady. "You helped shut down my father's restaurant. You took something from him." Catherine swallowed hard. I was just following orders. I didn't." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "That's the excuse? You were just doing your job?" Catherine looked away. "I was young. I didn't question things back then." Marcus stared at her. He could see the cracks in her armor now. The way her hands trembled, the way her breath came in uneven spurts. "I never wanted things to happen that way," she murmured. "But I didn't fight it, either." Marcus clenched his jaw. His father had fought for years to rebuild what he lost. He'd worked twice as hard for half the recognition. And here was a woman who had played a role in tearing it down, standing before him, finally acknowledging what she'd done. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he did something that surprised them both. He took a slow breath and said, "I'm catering the community event this weekend. You should come." Catherine blinked. "What? You heard me?" I don't understand." Marcus shrugged. "It's time you see what you tried to bury." Catherine hesitated, her face pale. But she nodded. That weekend, the community event was alive with laughter, music, and the rich aroma of smoked meats. Marcus stood behind his grill, serving up plates of ribs, brisket, and cornbread. His father's legacy, alive and thriving. And then, for the first time, he saw Catherine in a different light. Not as an enemy, but as a woman reckoning with the weight of her past. She took a plate from him with unsteady hands. Marcus met her eyes and said, "It's never too late to do the right thing." And for the first time, Catherine Whitmore looked like she believed it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the community park. Families gathered around picnic tables, laughter and conversation filling the air as the scent of hickory-smoked barbecue wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Marcus stood behind his grill, hands steady, heart full. This was what his father had dreamed of. Not just a business, but a space where people came together, where good food and good company could bridge gaps no one thought possible. Then he saw her. Catherine Whitmore stood at the edge of the event, clutching a plate of food Marcus had handed her earlier. She hadn't touched it yet. Instead, she seemed frozen, watching the scene unfold as if she didn't belong. Marcus wiped his hands on a towel and stepped away from the grill. "You gonna eat that or just let it get cold?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. Catherine startled slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to speak to her. She looked down at the plate in her hands. Ribs glistening with sauce, a side of cornbread, collard greens. Food that had built families. Food that had built his family. She exhaled sharply. I don't know why I'm here," she admitted. Marcus studied her. "Because you needed to be." Catherine swallowed. "I spent my whole life thinking I was on the right side of things. I told myself I was just doing my job, just following policies. But seeing all of this, knowing what I helped take away," she shook her head, her voice faltering. "I don't know how to fix it." Marcus crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. A part of him wanted to tell her that she couldn't fix it, that some damage was permanent, that his father had died never fully recovering from what had been stolen from him. But then he thought of his mother's words. "Let your work speak louder than their ignorance." "I don't need you to fix the past," he said finally. "But what are you going to do about the future?" Catherine's breath hitched, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. I did some digging," she said, hesitating before holding it out to him. Marcus frowned, taking the envelope and pulling out the papers inside. His breath caught. It was a legal document, proof that a commercial property, one of the last black-owned businesses in the area, was in danger of being pushed out by rezoning. "Same thing they did to your father," Catherine said softly. "I found out about it a few weeks ago, and I knew it was wrong." Marcus looked at her, his chest tightening. And, she said, her voice steadier now, "I still have some influence. I talked to people. I wrote letters. I filed complaints. The rezoning isn't happening." Marcus stared at her. He hadn't expected this. She let out a shaky breath. "I can't change what I did, but I can change what I do next." For the first time, Marcus saw something real in her eyes. Not just guilt, but responsibility. He nodded slowly, exhaling. "Then maybe you finally understand." And with that, he turned back toward the grill, leaving Catherine standing there, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and Marcus didn't give it. But as she took a seat at one of the picnic tables, finally taking a bite of the meal she once tried to erase, he knew that change, real change, was happening. And for now, that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the park, the last of the community event's attendees lingered. Children laughed as they chased fireflies, elders swapped stories over sweet tea, and neighbors, black, white, young, and old, shared in the joy of good food and good company. It was exactly the kind of night Marcus' father had always dreamed of, one where barriers blurred and humanity took center stage. Marcus exhaled, wiping his hands on a towel as he surveyed the scene. The grill was cooling, the final plates handed out, and still, Captain Whitmore sat alone at a picnic table, her untouched plate of barbecue in front of her. For a long time, she had been a shadow in his father's story, a faceless bureaucrat who had played a role in dismantling what his father built. But tonight, she was here, sitting among the people she had once, whether knowingly or not, helped push aside. Marcus walked over, hands in his pockets. "You didn't eat," he said. Catherine glanced at him, then back at the plate. "I don't know if I deserve to." Marcus sighed, sitting across from her. "It's barbecue, Catherine, not a confession booth." A small, dry chuckle escaped her, but the shame in her eyes remained. "I spent years justifying what I did," she admitted, telling myself I was following policies, that I didn't have any real power to change things. But the truth is, I did have power. I just didn't use it. She finally looked at him, and for the first time, Marcus didn't just see the woman who had once stood in his father's way. He saw someone at a crossroads, grappling with the weight of her own actions. He could have told her that what she did back then didn't matter anymore, that it was the past. But that wasn't the truth. The past did matter. It had shaped his father's struggles, shaped his struggles. What Catherine did had consequences, but the present mattered more. "You can't change what happened," Marcus said, voice steady. "But you did something about it today, and that counts for something." Catherine swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not handing it out," Marcus said plainly. "But I do believe people can do better." For a long moment, she was silent. Then, she reached for her fork, hesitated, and finally took a bite of the ribs. Her eyes widened slightly as the flavors hit. Smoke, spice, something passed down through generations. It was more than just food. It was history. Marcus stood up, watching as she took another bite, this time slower, more reverent. Then he patted the table lightly. "Welcome to the neighborhood." She looked up, startled. Then, after a beat, she nodded. As Marcus walked back toward the grill, Mrs. Ruiz caught his eye from across the park, raising an approving eyebrow. He smirked and shook his head, grabbing a cold drink before settling onto a bench. His father once told him, "People will always try to take what's yours. Your job is to make sure they never take your dignity with it." Tonight, Marcus had done just that. And in doing so, he had built something his father would have been proud of, not just a business, but a legacy of resilience, of justice, and perhaps of change. For now, that was enough. A month later, Marcus stood in front of the old lot where his father's restaurant once stood. The building was long gone, replaced by a soulless high-rise, but today, something new was beginning. A sign stood proudly in the ground. "Coming soon, Whitmore and Jones Community Kitchen." The name had been Marcus' idea. Catherine had protested at first, unsure if she even deserved to be part of it. But Marcus had insisted. "You wanted to do better? Then let people see your name on something that builds instead of tears down." She had agreed. The community kitchen would be a space for local chefs, small business owners, and anyone who needed a start, just like his father had once needed. It wouldn't erase the past, but it would make sure no one else had to live the same struggle. As Marcus stood there, watching the workers begin construction, Catherine arrived, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Didn't think you'd show up," Marcus said, taking one. She smirked. "Still got work to do." Marcus nodded. They both did. As the sun rose higher in the sky, a breeze carried the scent of barbecue from a nearby street vendor. A new chapter was beginning. Not just for Marcus, not just for Catherine, but for the community they were building together. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something settle inside him. Not forgiveness, but peace.